There is a sleeping mat rolled up against a wall, and it has been rolled up against that wall for 1400 years. Nobody ever unrolled it. The fire in the hearth a few steps away was still alive when the ash came down, and the evening meal had already been eaten, and the digging tools had already been carried in from the fields and set down in the place they were always set down. Everything in this house tells you the same thing. The day had ended normally. So where did everybody go? You are standing in a village called Joya de Cerén, in what is now western El Salvador, and you are standing under about 15 feet of volcanic ash. Nobody was looking for this place. In 1976, a bulldozer driver was leveling ground for a government agricultural project, clearing space for grain storage silos, and his blade cut through the corner of a clay wall. The wall was so well preserved that the first people to see it assumed it was modern and unimportant. Would you have thought otherwise? It was not modern. It was a Maya farming village, and it had been sitting there intact since the 7th century. 2 years later, an archaeologist from the University of Colorado named Payson Sheets began to dig. He worked in 1978 and in 1980, then the Salvadoran Civil War stopped everything, and excavation did not resume until 1988. It has continued ever since. And in all those decades of digging, the thing that has never been found here is a body, not one. There are hearths with the fire still laid in them. There are mats that were never unrolled. There are hollows in the ash where living plants stood, hollows so precise that archaeologists pour dental plaster into them and pull out a cast of a stalk that stopped growing in the 7th century. There is everything a life leaves behind. Where are the people? To understand what happened here, you have to understand what was underneath the village before the village existed. Some decades earlier, a volcano called Ilopango erupted so violently that it buried much of central El Salvador in white ash and emptied the land of anyone living on it. Nobody agrees on when. One team, working from around 100 radiocarbon dates taken from tree trunks the eruption killed, argues for the year 539 or 540. Another team matched the volcanic glass to a layer inside a Greenland ice core more than 4,000 miles away and argues for the year 431, give or take 2 years. That disagreement is real, it is current, and it is unresolved. It matters here for one reason only. Whenever it happened, the white ash eventually weathered down into extraordinarily good soil. And people came back. They farmed the Zapatitan Valley along a river in a village of roughly 200 people. Not a city, not a capital, no pyramid, no king, no carved monument with a ruler's name on it. Just a village, one of hundreds like it, scattered across El Salvador and Guatemala and Honduras. The kind of place that normally never gets written about because there is normally nothing left of it to write about. And then, about 600 meters north of the houses, magma began forcing its way upward through the rock. When it finally broke loose, it broke loose directly underneath the river. What happens when magma meets a river? The whole thing detonates as steam. There would have been a shrieking noise as it began. There is also a suggestion, drawn from the crack patterns in the earthen walls, that a small earthquake shook the village shortly before, though that is an inference read backward from damage rather than an event anyone recorded. What is not in doubt is that a blast of hot steam and fine ash and gas hit the village, and that layer followed layer, and that when the mountain had finished, the houses lay under 4 to 7 meters of ash. The people got out. How do you know the hour of an evening 1400 years ago? You read the plants. The maize in the fields had reached a particular stage of maturity, and certain plants were fruiting and others were not, and taken together, those say the eruption came in the middle of the rainy season, most likely in late August or September. The objects say the rest. The farm tools were already stored, the hearth fires were lit, the meal was finished, and the sleeping mats had not yet been unrolled onto the floor. That is a specific window inside a specific day. After work, before bed, the exact year is harder, and here you should be careful, because nearly every account you will ever read hands you one confident number. Why would a date be uncertain? Radiocarbon dating measures how much of an unstable form of carbon is left in something that was once alive, and it does not return a birthday. It returns a probability band. The evidence from this site supports a range, roughly between the years 610 and 671, and a recent statistical remodeling of those dates centers the eruption near the year 620. The range is the honest answer. The single confident date is a habit. Now walk into the village, because this is where the story turns over. You have been told in one form or another your whole life that ordinary people in ancient societies lived miserably, that the temples and the palaces were the achievement and everyone else was the labor, that a commoner in the classic Maya world was a barely fed farmer who handed over his surplus and received nothing back. So go and look inside these houses. Each household here kept 3 separate buildings, one for living and sleeping, one for storage, one as a kitchen. The walls were wattle and daub, meaning a lattice of poles and vines packed with clay, and that construction is remarkably earthquake-resistant, because it flexes instead of shattering, and when it does fail, it fails in small, harmless pieces. Each household owned around 70 complete pottery vessels. 70. Almost a quarter of those were polychromes, meaning finely painted multicolored serving ware, and those had not been made anywhere nearby. They came from the Copan Valley, about 120 kilometers to the north. Every household had obsidian tools, volcanic glass worked into blades and scrapers. Every household had at least one jade axe. Does that sound like an underclass to you? They ate well too. Analysis of the plant remains found maize everywhere, the most common living plant recovered from the village, with more than 180 specimens from the village alone, over twice the count of any other species. One storehouse still had a full corn crib in it when it was abandoned. Around the buildings grew chili peppers, agave for fiber, avocado, guava, and cacao. These farmers had chocolate trees in the yard, and the animal remains say they were eating white-tailed deer, duck, peccary, and domestic dog. They also had a sauna. One household maintained a steam bath for several households to share, with solid earthen walls and a domed roof of wattle and daub, a bench running around the inside that could seat 10 or 12 people, and evidence that water was poured over a firebox in the middle to raise the steam. A dome, built by Maya farmers centuries before any European reached the Americas. Who told you commoners lived in hovels? In 2007, working a field a couple of 100 meters south of the houses, the team found something nobody had found anywhere before. Planting beds, long parallel ridges separated by walkways, and inside the ash hollows left by rotted plants, cast in dental plaster, the unmistakable shape of manioc. Manioc, also called cassava or yucca, is a starchy root crop that is strikingly productive, grows in poor soil, and shrugs off drought. 2 more seasons of test pits showed the field ran at least a third the size of a football pitch. And the beds preserved a sequence. The crop had been harvested and then replanted with fresh stalk cuttings, only days before the volcano erupted. That is the first and still the only intensive manioc field ever documented at any archaeological site in the Americas. Does that mean manioc fed the wider Maya world? That question is genuinely open, and the archaeologists who found the field published it as a question rather than an answer. Because one field in one village cannot settle it. Then, in 2011, the diggers hit a road. The Maya word is sakbe, which means white way, and these are usually raised causeways lined with stone and surfaced in white lime plaster. This one had no stone at all. It was about 2 meters wide, built from packed white ash left by that earlier eruption, shored up along its edges, with a drainage canal running down each side. It is the only sakbe ever found built that way. It runs into the village and splits, heading toward the plaza and toward 2 religious buildings. And one reading is that the villagers used it to escape south, away from the mountain, though a road is far easier to prove than a direction of flight. Follow it in. What was at the end of it? At the eastern end of the village, on the highest ground, stood 2 buildings that were not houses. Both had walls painted white with fine ash, and picked out in red. One of them has a doorway and 2 lattice windows, and inside were sets of small objects meant to be cast onto the floor and read. This appears to have been where a diviner worked, someone who told people what was coming. The diviner did not live there. A client could come to the front window and describe a problem, and the reading happened in the innermost room, and the answer came back out through the second window, and payment was often left behind as an object. Those objects lean heavily toward tools associated with women, spindle whorls for spinning cotton thread and stones for grinding food, with nothing distinctly masculine among them, which is why the diviner is usually described as a woman. That is an inference from what was left behind, not a fact anyone wrote down. 5 meters away stood a second building, and it held more food than any other structure excavated at the site. It had grinding stones and a hearth, and a half-height wall over which food could be handed out to people waiting outside. Inside there was a large vessel decorated with the head and legs of a caiman, filled with achiote seeds, which yield a brilliant red pigment that stood in for blood then and still stands in for it now. And beside it lay a deer skull headdress. It still carried its white and red and blue paint. It still carried the string used to tie it onto someone's head. Traditional Maya communities still use headdresses like it in ceremonies, giving thanks for a harvest. Can you see what that means about the night? There is also a story often told about a small obsidian blade found on a shelf in that same room. That testing showed human blood on it and that it had been used in ritual bloodletting. Treat that story gently. Blood residue analysis on stone tools has failed blind tests, and the proteins involved may simply not survive that long, so the blade is a story told about the room rather than a fact established about it. And facing the plaza stood the largest and most imposing building in the village, with 2 benches in its front room. In Maya architecture, a bench in a front room signals authority. Ordinary houses put their bench in the innermost private room for sleeping. This one put 2 of them out front, where people could be received. On one of them sat the biggest pot ever found in the village, which likely held a fermented drink made from maize or manioc, and above it a painted vessel just the right size for pouring out a serving. The reading is that village elders sat here, heard disputes between families, and sealed the settlement with a drink. That is an interpretation of a room, and it deserves to be held as one. So here is the reframe, and it reaches a great deal further than one village. The archaeologist who has spent his career here argues that these people ran their own affairs, that they chose their own crops, built their own houses, ran their own religion, and dealt with the nobility of the valley mainly as customers who could take their business to a different marketplace if they disliked the prices. That is his argument, and it is contested, because this village sits on the southeastern edge of the Maya world. It captures a single evening, and the marketplaces those Copan bowls came from were run by elites. But strip the argument back to what nobody disputes, and something just as large survives. For a century, the picture of Maya commoners was assembled out of sites that had already been stripped bare. When a village is abandoned in the ordinary way, the people carry off everything usable, and then others take the timber, and then the thatch fails, and the rain melts the clay from the walls, and then trees take root and churn whatever is left. What survives is broken pottery and low mounds. And archaeologists looking at broken pottery and low mounds concluded that the people who lived there had almost nothing. Do you see the error? They were not looking at poverty, they were looking at decay. That is what Joya de Cerén actually proves, and it is why it matters far beyond El Salvador. It is often called the Pompeii of the Americas, and that comparison misleads twice over. Pompeii was a wealthy Roman town of concrete houses and marble. This was a farming village of 200 people. And because the ash that fell here was fine and hot and damp, rather than dry and pebbled, the preservation of organic material at Joya de Cerén is actually better than at Pompeii. Thatch, rope, beans still sitting in a pot. Now think about your own home for a moment. How much of it is stone? Almost none. Your clothes, your food, your books, the wood of the table, the bed you sleep in, the letters and the photographs that would tell anyone who you actually were. Give it 4 centuries of rain and roots and scavenging, and what remains of your life is a foundation outline and some ceramic fragments, and one day somebody will stand over it and estimate what you had. They will get it wrong in exactly one direction. They will make you poorer than you were. The record does not preserve people evenly. It preserves stone, and stone is what powerful people built with. Everyone else survives as an absence, and an absence is very easy to mistake for an emptiness. Which brings you back to that sleeping mat. For 1400 years, it has looked like the wreckage of an interrupted night. Something left behind by people running for their lives. But look at it again. It is not really evidence that they fled. It is evidence that they lived. The mat, the full corn crib, the 70 pots, the cacao tree in the yard, the sauna bench, the manioc replanted for a harvest that never came. Ordinary people on an ordinary evening, with far more than anyone thought they had. The volcano did not bury a village, it saved one.